Hi everybody, and welcome to an edition of Shed Share that I am so excited about. So I'm sharing the shed today with, gosh, you try saying that in a hurry. Sharing the shed today with three colleagues who I am so excited to talk to, but also really excited to introduce to each other, because it turns out we're all trust geeks. And, you know, we've all got different experiences with trust. And I think between us, we should hopefully have an interesting conversation, but particularly in the light of the current crisis and leadership, I think the topic of trust is coming even more to the forefront than it already was. So we did name this talk, We Should Talk About Trust. And this is a bit of an in-joke, particularly for myself, Pete and Keith, who have been talking about trust together for some time now. So I'm sure some of that will come out as we go through this talk. So if I just kick off by explaining where my fascination with trust and leadership started. So I was lucky enough to work for Boots the Chemist a chunk of time ago now, but I was there about 8 years. And one of the roles that I did while I was there was working with Boots, trying to improve the relationship with their key suppliers. And in particular, I was working with Boots, L'Oreal and Procter & Gamble, and we just couldn't get these relationships to work. So essentially, I ran a project looking at what the barrier was, and not surprisingly, really, that there were trust things that needed to be worked on. At the same time, I was doing an MBA. So I used the MBA dissertation as an opportunity to get into looking at trust and how to really enable fantastic business collaboration, business leadership, etc., through the topic of trust. And it's really stayed with me ever since. But if I turn to Pete, if you want to explain your background, Pete. So I'll say it quickly. I've known Pete now for about 18 months or something like that. Pete has recently started a new venture, Team 2030. He's also just written a report about trust, which I'm sure he'll refer to. But prior to that, he spent many, many years leading the Windsor Society of Leadership Fellows at Windsor Castle, St George's House one. And that's where I met Pete. And inevitably, in some of the conversations there, trust was always a feature.
Thank you ever so much, Sarah. It's great to be part of this. I think you're right about us being trust geeks. And I thought to myself, why has trust been an obsession for so many years? And I think I've come at it from two very different angles. From the first angle, I think there's been something about my fascination with religion and the church that has led me to trust, because I think there's a spiritual dimension to trust for many of us. The sense that we believe in some way we can't put into words, we are connected with each other, ultimately at least. And I think our interest in trust is shorthand for us wanting to engage with other people as if we are part of them and they are part of us. And having just said it like that, we know there's that mushy side to trust. Some people think, oh my God, that sounds really up there. And that's why some people think trust is all a bit weak and fluffy and, you know, churchy and vicarish. But that's there. Then the other bit, which is very different, has been my interest in people who are very successful, either in public life or in business and commerce. And I think having been involved in sort of national student politics in my early 20s, and some of those people going on to different leadership positions over the years, having been close to some and watched them in their roles, I think most of the most successful leaders I've got to know have been in relationships with tightly knit groups of people around them, where they've had exceptionally high levels of trust that convert into an almost tribal loyalty first model of trust leadership. But it is a high trust model of leadership. It's got many dysfunctions, but my point is trust is deployed by some of the most significant leaders in my view, just about every sector, to great effect. So I think if you want to understand leadership, trust is part of understanding some of those people. I think we give it away too freely on the whole. And I think part of the trust challenge is to be, I'm more interested in tough trust than that, rather than
we'll come back to that, I'm sure. We'll come back to that. I've heard of tough love, now we're going to have tough trust. Excellent. So if I turn to John just to do an introduction. So I met John, I think it was December last year, when we ended up at a roundtable event with the Times Raconteur, and we were talking about leadership, and you were there along with a couple of other experts and some fellow chief executives. And I was absolutely fascinated when you started talking, particularly because you love trust so much. You've written an entire book about it, but also set up a not-for-profit organization to help build high trust teams and high trust environments. So I mean, I straight away was wanting to know more about that, and we've caught up several times since then. But do you want to give us a bit more background to that, John?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Great to be in the shed with the trust geeks. That's something I'm really
you don't get
really
to
enjoying
every day, do you?
So yeah, my fascination with trust. I mean, I had a corporate career, but like you said, you mentioned you worked at Boots. So I came through a fairly typical corporate career. And in my last corporate role, which now is 17 years ago, I was international managing director in a FTSE 100 company, which shall remain nameless for the purpose of this this introduction. But I bumped into my group chief executive one morning on the 6th floor of the HQ in London, and to share with him what I thought was some good news. The day before, we'd closed the biggest deal that we'd ever closed in my sector, £32 million outsourcing deal. To which I was confronted with the riposte, you think that's good, do you? And I decided to stand my ground, and I said to my boss, yeah, I think it's great. And at that point, a finger came out and went straight into my face. And I heard this voice booming in my ears saying, you know your problem, Blakey. And I thought, no, but I'm clearly going to be unveiled of a lifetime's ignorance in that department. You're too effing nice. And he walked off. And I was stood there in a 21st century corridor of leadership thinking, my biggest problem is I'm too effing nice. And I'm thinking, too effing nice for what? You know, and it was that moment of choice really that I felt I had. Was I going to stand for trust, or was I going to stand for power? You know, what sort of world did I want to be part of, and what sort of world did I want to be part of creating? And I think that was that moment where I just thought, I have to make a stand for trust, you know, for people who are trusted, that is a key to performance, as Pete has alluded to. And it's also a way that you can look in the mirror at the end of your career and say, I actually stood for something that was worth it, whether I was successful or not. At least I made a stand around something that I feel passionate about. And so that was the spark really that ignited my path with trust.
John, that's absolutely brilliant. And thank God you are too effing nice, really. That's all I can I'm proud to be one as well. So,
yeah.
So and Keith, we obviously met as well through the Windsor leadership circles. Now, you used to work in big corporate as well. I mean, Rolls-Royce doesn't come much bigger in terms of corporate, and I know that you had to develop a lot of trust there because you were implementing agile methodology, which is obviously massively reliant on trust and empowerment, etc., etc. But now you've set up your own business again to advise businesses on trust. Talk us through that journey and what made you decide to set up Project4 Learning Lab.
Yeah, interesting question, and it's a privilege to be on the call today and a privilege to be in your virtual shed, Sarah. I've heard and seen.
Always welcome, always welcome, Keith.
Thank you, appreciate that. Yeah, I guess my sort of trust geekiness goes back a while. Actually, it goes back to the end of the last century with my my first leadership role, where I was in Rolls-Royce as a large corporate, and I sort of followed that traditional pathway of be part of the team, and then as a first leadership role, be a team leader in the team you're a part of. And it was then that trust sort of moved from a sort of abstract concept in my mind to something quite interesting, in that it felt like overnight I turned from one of us to one of them. As I made that transition, I thought, that's a bit weird, because I haven't changed. The way I think and what I believe hasn't changed, but others' perception of me has. And that first role, part of the reason I took it was for stretch, but also the fact that we had the opportunity to create something new and build something which really floats my boat. And as it happened, as time developed, we ended up closing the department, and I ended up making people redundant, sadly, in my first leadership role, including myself. And so I thought, oh, okay, that's quite a journey, but in my journey as a leader, that was fantastic. I've got trust nailed. I know all about this now. And then I took my second role. I got this job where I was leading a team where I didn't know what they did. And more importantly, they knew that I didn't know what they did. And that sort of presented a whole new challenge. And it was about 2 or 3 weeks into that role where they said, we think you've been appointed to close us down. I'm like, what? So sort of my interest and geekiness in trust sort of sprang from my early experiences with leadership, I guess. And that's continued through to the present day. And off the back of odysseys in deploying Agile in a large corporate organization, I decided to branch out on my own and see if I could help others learn from my experience. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you. So there are some similarities when we listen to our journeys, sorry to use that phrase, but I think we have all kind of picked something up in the corporate world or the equivalent of the corporate world and realized there was something there that sparked that imagination and kept it going. What's going on in the world at the moment is clearly taking this to a whole new level. So you will have seen the Edelman Trust Barometer stats pre-COVID, talking about the fact that chief execs have about a 39% trust rating. I know these are massive generalizations, but interestingly, trust in employers was running at about 77%, which was significantly higher than trust in virtually every other institution in the country, including politicians, church, everything else. So my question is, well, firstly, isn't that interesting? What role do you think business leadership needs to play to establish and build trust, given quite a solid foundation? But probably more importantly, those figures were pre-COVID. If the survey was done again now, where do you think trust has gone in the last few months, and particularly trust in business leadership? Somebody kick us off. Peter.
Shall I go with that?
Yeah, go for it, John. Go for it.
Okay.
Yeah, it was an intriguing question to be asked, Sarah, because Edelman actually produced an updated report in May. They did a spring update to that annual barometer that they do that comes out in January. So they did one that was in the middle of the pandemic. And one of the questions they asked was, do you believe the following leaders are doing an outstanding job in managing the crisis? And they had, options between government leaders, journalists, CEOs, scientists. And interestingly, the scientists scored the highest. 53% thought that scientists were doing an outstanding job. Government leaders, 45%. Journalists, 31% thought they were doing an outstanding job. And only 29% thought that CEOs were doing an outstanding job.
Oh, backwards in a very short space of time there as well.
Yes, and I could see your sort of surprise on that. It was a surprise to me as well. But the way it was positioned when I listened to the sort of briefing of that report was that there was a suggestion that it was a moment of reckoning for business, because there's been a lot of talk in business about stakeholder capitalism and moving on from what I would call the industrial model, profit-driven model. But I think there's a moment of reckoning going on around people saying, are they just talking the talk? Are they actually really going to walk the walk? And in the crisis in particular, how is business weighing up the balance between profit, people, planet, and the various different stakeholder agendas? So I think it is a time of reckoning for CEOs. And we've got to be very, very careful, I think, with the choices that we make in this time, because I think there will be retrospective judgment around that for all leaders and for all brands. So it is, I think, a very sensitive moment in the trust equation.
Yeah, thanks, John. You and I met, didn't we, just before lockdown? It was probably early March, something like that. And I remembered your words, and genuinely they influenced how I behaved over the next few weeks, because you said to me, this is a moment of truth. With what was about to happen, and that really, really resonated with me. I do think it's a moment of truth, but how interesting that went backwards so quickly, so dramatically. What's your views, Pete?
Well, I'm always a bit hesitant about general surveys, how people feel about chief executives, because to an extent that reflects, I think, how we feel about the economic system as a whole. And I think we all feel our economic system as a whole is in fundamental crisis. Absolutely. We're not sure what would be better, but our system is failing us big time. Yeah. There has not been the sharing of wealth that we thought would happen through globalization. And so we're now dealing with something where the theory, the expectation has bombed. And also in the midst of a pandemic, it has been scary as hell for everyone. What has struck me from the work we've done with you and some of your Shakespeare Martineau team, Sarah, and a number of other CEOs, has been, I think, in a number of organizations where we've worked very closely with staff at different levels, they have felt there's been a leveling dimension to the responses to COVID that has actually brought them closer to their top team. If you think of the experience now, You know, most people are meeting with the CEO, they're up in the boardroom or the CEO's office, and the CEO's at the head of the table. Yeah. Here we are on a screen, level playing field. We've each got our postage. Yeah, you're on the shed, but we've got our postage stamp, and someone new joins, it moves around the screen. There's no natural CEO centrality. And on the whole, many organizations have stories of CEOs talking to more people more regularly, in more listening mode, and also being riskier in messaging with their people across the organization, and really putting themselves out there in a more upfront way. I think there are many good things to be told about the business side. I think the huge problem we have is on the public side, which you might want to come on to in a minute, because I think there's been a very different experience there, which I think is important for the wider discussion around trust. But I'll hold back on that.
Yeah, I agree. Keith, what's your views on this?
Yeah, I think it's probably helpful to differentiate between the people who know us and the people who perceive us. You know, so Pete talked about the connection of CEOs with their leadership team and the people in their organization and how they create that. And then surveys are driven by gross perceptions, which may reflect reality or may not. And it's probably never been a more sensitive time for marketing and branding and positioning. And as John said, it's a moment of truth, and it's not a moment in which we're necessarily going to be judged right now, but our actions will be judged with the benefit of hindsight in the future. And so I think this idea of trust, I think the concept of it is different when we're talking about personal connections relative to perceptions from others who don't know us and we don't know them.
And we've all alluded to the fact that it matters enormously at the moment, but without making this blatantly obvious, why does it matter enormously at the moment?
Because of the personal dimension. Because I think, following on from what Keith has just said, I think certain brands have built trust. So as a kid, I used to think British Airways was absolutely the best. And we've seen over a whole number of years the crushing and the destruction of that brand standing in many people's eyes. And there's a whole number of major global brands where I think that's happened. And again, our interpersonal relationships with certain people, when we get to know them, we see the real them. Even when we see the warts and their mistakes, I think if we feel they're straight with us and we know where we stand with them, that means the world. And in a time of crisis, thinking, I hear what they say, actually they might be a bit grumpy or a bit, you know, short-tempered or difficult, but actually they're straight, they're doing their best, they're candid, they're the real deal. We want those leaders. We trust those people. It's that personal connection in everything that counts more than at any time than in a crisis.
Yeah. John, do you have a view on why it matters even more, building on what Pete said?
Yeah, I think, again, just echoing the same theme, maybe using slightly different language, but I think psychological safety is something that's talked a lot about, you know, in relation to trust, that the highest performing teams are those where there is that psychological safety, and that's really an outcome of trust. And I think if we're living in unsafe times, and if there is that level of vulnerability that people are feeling around either health or finances, or even just the future of work, you know, and where is it all going? So there is that heightened vulnerability, and therefore I think people are seeking safety, and they seek it physically. We put face masks on and we have social distancing, and we have a response in terms of the physical safety agenda. I think trust is part of the response to people feeling psychologically unsafe, and therefore brands that stand for trust, leaders that stand for trust, will attract people because there'll be a sense of a zone of safety, if you like, around them, which I think is going to be increasingly powerful as an attractor of clients and talent.
Are you finding this with your clients, Keith, when you're talking to your clients now in the post or still during COVID scenario? Is this something that is coming up their agenda?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, external events have made clients feel vulnerable, you know, and really critically evaluate how they were and how they're operating today and how they need to operate in the future. And clearly there's so much uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, volatility around that it's really difficult to plot a course for the future. So as leaders, how do we give our teams safety, or a sense of safety, when there's so much uncertainty around? And we've certainly seen with a number of clients that they're changing how they operate, they're changing how they engage people, and potentially they're looking to develop in different directions as they sort of start to think about how the world might look in 12 months, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now.
Yeah,
really interesting times.
Something that's really resonated with me is this need for certainty. Of course, there's an irony here. If we go too far trying to create certainty for people, and we say things that we can't promise or that we can't make true, all we've done is create a false sense of certainty for a short period of time, which will then breach trust going forward. So for me, it's felt like a really delicate balancing act between being really honest with people, but also trying to give a little bit of certainty, or a little bit of choice, or a little bit of control back as well, but within a kind of an envelope of being incredibly honest and open about what's going on. So we will have all had trust models. I mean, and some of us have written books on it as well. Things that we've relied on over the years in terms of the concepts or the principles behind trust, or the things we've always gone to when we're trying to create trust. Has the crisis made you reevaluate any of the things that you thought were certain? Or have there been things within that have really amplified for you that say, if you're really trying to create trust, this is what you would now focus on? Peter, have you got an answer on this one?
I'd love to try a thought on that, and let's, because I've been thinking hard about this, especially the last few weeks as we've done this project together. And I think there's something, it links in with your point about certainty. I want to make it a control word rather than certainty, because I think nearly every leader I know who's a successful leader is a bit of a control freak. I think, you know, we all need to be control freaks to a significant degree to steer any organization through amazingly choppy waters. And we're in a situation, the moment lockdown happened, everyone thought, oh my God, I've lost complete control in a way I never thought would be possible in my life. The control freak has a complete nervous breakdown on day one. And yet remarkably, the world was still here on day two. And even more remarkably, when people thought, oh, it's going to be a nightmare, some teams who went to complete home working, having never worked from home before, became more productive, spoke to each other more than they've ever done before. And we've got countless stories of some people who've been very blocking in behavior, said, I can't do that. That's not my job. I can't do that. Said, okay, it's a crisis. I'll take that on. I'll make it work. And all sorts of things begun to flow at a time of real crisis and uncertainty and loss of control. I think now, whatever happens, A, we know COVID will be here to some degree for years. B, there might be another variation at any stage in the future in our lives. So this is now part of the new reality, the new permanent, is that uncertainty, loss of control will always be there, quite close to any leader's thinking. But I think the point is now every leader will have some part of their life that is digital. As a digital leader, I think we're beginning to see the whole decision-making process can change. Because when you work digitally, you can let decisions evolve more gradually over a period of time. You can have a bite-sized chunk model of decision-making. You can say, well, try that. Let's think about that. We'll come back to it in 3 days' time and look at how it moves on. I think there can be more evolution in decision-making that reassures people more and takes them with us more when we're taking risky decisions. Because one of the problems in many organizations, in the traditional meeting, the board overnighter, my stable diet for about 30 years was doing board away days, board retreats. And some people on boards love a big decision for the 5-year plan in the overnight retreat. Back at the ranch, the CEO has a whole number of people who are reflectors, who go panicky, who have a hairy canary when the board has changed the world overnight, and they've got to have a whole new operating model, right? This new digital leadership model, you shouldn't have to have that. You can edge into difficult zones, take your anxious people with you, try it out, try it a bit more, go deeper into the water. So I think the leadership model can evolve significantly as we combine digital with physical.
And Keith, that's starting to sound remarkably like agile to me. What do you think?
I was just thinking definitely agile.
You're right.
I thought maybe I've infected Pete's mind.
Good luck with that. I've been trying for ages.
All feedback's a gift. it's not purely the digital, it's the speed of feedback. And I think the digital means, I guess, that Pete's talking about is the speed of connection, the speed at which we can convene a meeting, convene a discussion, then we can pick it up, think about it, put it down and have another go. I think that's really important. But I also think the trick becomes moving away from these long-term goals where this is our 5-year vision and therefore we're going to have all of these activities lined up, and if we do this then we get this outcome, then we'll do that, and we'll do that, and the world just isn't like that. So I think those companies that thrive take that long-term goal and then break it down into what does that mean we need to do now, and how will we know that it's had the desired outcome, and aligning those actions with the speed of feedback that tells us whether we've got what we expected to get or not, and then adapt our course accordingly. I think those organizations that balance that, this is our direction of travel, but this is what we need to do right now, and if that works, great, and if it doesn't, we'll try something else.
And explain to me how trust plays a role in that. Is this to do with devolution? Is it to do with empowerment? Is it to do with the lack of, as Pete said, letting go of control, having to trust the teams more at the coalface? Is that where the connection is?
I think there's different things at different levels. So there's definitely an element of trust if you're a board member and you're looking for your teams to execute strategy, whatever that means these days. Then there's a trust element there, isn't there? You know, do you understand the direction of travel? Do you have the means to achieve what we're trying to achieve? Requires trust. But I'm also struck by what you said earlier, Sarah, around this uncertainty and making promises and looking to introduce clarity where the world's volatile and uncertain. And so I think humility becomes really important. None of us know all of the answers. We just take in information and then we try and make the best decision to take action that we can in the moment. And I think it becomes really important to reflect that we may be wrong, we don't know, there are no certainties, let's do something, let's learn, let's change. And that for me is one of the key elements of trust, being able to show that and being able to encourage that in others.
There's a huge amount of openness implied in that, to explain to people what you're thinking, and this idea that we don't have all the answers. I'd be grateful to have any, actually. We're all just kind of human beings doing our best, and this is something that I've been saying to my guys for a while. I've also spent a lot more time asking them for answers, actually. Because I think this is a great time to do that and to kind of reverse that a little bit and reverse that flow of ideas and information. But John, if you were, here's the acid question, if you were writing your book now, would you still write it with the same 9 pillars, or do you think you would be inclined to give a different emphasis maybe, or is there something missing? What's really striking you at the moment?
Well, the second edition, I finished the second edition of updating the second edition of the book in the first week of lockdown. So heaven help me if I got it wrong, because the ink is dry on it now. So, but I think one of the reasons I wanted to put myself in the classroom with trust and to research trust at Aston Business School was because as a coach, I've been talking about trust a lot, and as we all are, I'm passionate about it. But when people said to me, how do I do trust? You know, I believe in it, I'm passionate about it, but how do I do it? I didn't really have a scientifically based answer to that question. I could talk about my experience, other people's experience, but I think the value of research is that you can generate something that hopefully is robust over a period of time and resilient through different circumstances. The 9 Habits of Trust, which is the model that came out of my research, is one that we've been working with now with a lot of different teams in this crisis. And what I notice is that there is some tension between those habits, and those habits, some habits are shouting for more attention at the moment than others. So if I give you some examples, 3 habits of ability. So I talk about 3 habits of ability, 3 habits of integrity, and 3 habits of benevolence. If we looked at the habits of ability, one of the habits there is deliver. That as to be trusted leaders, we need to deliver. And I think the conversation that Keith and Pete have just been having there about the agility of our delivery habit needs to go to another level in response to this crisis. So I'm definitely seeing a different attention to how do we deliver, and very consistent with what Keith and Pete have been saying there about, 12-week sprints rather than 3-year global domination sort of plans. So that would be something I would pull out, I suppose, from the areas of ability. In terms of the 3 habits of integrity: be honest, be open, be humble. So Keith has talked about being humble, and I think a crisis is inevitably humbling to us, and therefore there's been, I think, more talk about that habit. The other one is that be honest habit. I think, Sarah, you mentioned that there's a lot of difficult decisions to be made, a lot of dilemmas to confront, and I'm reminded about Jim Collins' phrase about confront the brutal facts. I think at the moment leaders are challenged to be brutally honest about the facts, because if we try to sugarcoat it all just because we want to sort of give people what they want to hear, as you said, people are too savvy, they're too sort of experienced at this to be caught up in any spin. And then in the areas of benevolence, maybe just pick one out there. 3 habits of benevolence would be evangelize, be brave, be kind. And evangelize is an interesting word. Sometimes you have to spend a bit longer explaining that. But evangelize effectively is partly about sharing the good news and having this vision and loving what you do and that sense of purpose. But evangelists are also very resilient. Evangelists don't know when they're knocked down. They don't know how not to get back up again. And I think resilience is something that we're all going to have to demonstrate as we go through the stages of this crisis. It's going to be a long race, as Pete alluded to. And I think the habit of evangelism and being resilient and bouncing back is going to be something that we'll have to show to keep the trust of the people that we're leading.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Pete's touched on this already, but we are now moving into a world permanently where part of our leadership role is going to be digital. So if I talk about my business, but I think it's probably fair to say, Pete, this was true for all of the businesses that were involved in your recent research project, we were expecting to move to a more blended model where some of the time we'll all be working from home and carrying on trying to run the business like we are here in our little neat squares, and other times we'll be in offices collaborating with each other. So we're moving to a very different phase, and a huge amount of our communication as leaders is going to be in these little square boxes, making videos or having meetings virtually. What is it you think leaders need to do more of in this virtual world, especially if they're trying to develop trust, and if we want to get back from that 29%, that figure in May? What is it that would catapult that back into a decent level of trust with leaders, particularly in a virtual world?
Can I just try one thought there? I think early on in the pandemic, I think a crisis plays well to those who are very high energy leaders. I think of yourself, Sarah, as an example of a very high energy.
I'm exhausted, Pete.
and I do think a lot of CEOs went into this as a sprint.
Yeah.
And then realised it was becoming a marathon, and now feel knackered, seriously knackered.
Absolutely.
And around them, quite a few people are experiencing not just Zoom exhaustion, but crisis exhaustion.
Yeah.
And also remember, and I'm so struck by it still, by a number of people who will say they have not been out of their front door since March. I know some people in quite senior positions who absolutely have not gone anywhere. And
I'm virtually one of them. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I think people literally who have not gone beyond the front door, and who have all sorts of anxieties, which are quite profound anxiety phobias associated with it. And so I think for a period of time, we need to be very supportive of each other in managing our different ways back. So I think there's something about, at this stage, a key priority in leadership is to say to people, if you've got a fear, which is real for you, then share it, say it, don't bottle it. And don't come and be pissy with someone about a corporate issue, about a performance issue, and actually it's because you're fearful. Say you're fearful and we'll honour you for it and respect it, but we need to get it out there.
Yeah.
And this is why I think teams are so important. I think too many organisations in time of crisis go corporate, they go big. The CEO or the people director will talk to every member of the organisation about something, and actually want you to say, look, discuss this in your team, not just your line manager, with your team. Because they're your support group, you are their support group. get it out there, and find your way as a team to help each other through this protracted period.
And do you think the virtual world is helping or hindering those kind of honest conversations?
I think the problem with the virtual world is people who want to hide find it slightly easier to hide when we're on a Zoom or Teams call than when we're in the same room. So I think we have a responsibility when people aren't being fully transparent with us to say, I think so. If we were talking, say, Sarah, I think there's something more you need to tell me about why you say you might not be back in the office till January. You might have a right not to be there, but it's a big issue for us in your team. So help us understand why you're so fearful of coming back when we're going to be doing the public transport struggle every morning and putting our masks on and off. So just to say to people, have that discussion as a confidential, off-the-record team discussion, but have it. And we need you to have it, because what I really do think is an issue is we've all been traumatized in different ways. Yes. And trauma, as we know, goes on for years. I mean, part of my work over some years has been working with boards and exec teams when there's been a resignation of a CEO or a chair over a trust issue. And what's amazing about the trauma after that, some people feel it so keenly that they've almost got physical reaction to it, that you can see it in their face. Other people, they just go across the surface, they've almost passed them by. Oh, so-and-so's gone, well, what the hell, didn't like them anyway, on with the business. So we all react very differently. And I think a leader's got to say, we're all in different places on this. Each one needs to be okay. Don't look for one common place to be at, because there will never be a common place. And if we can accept that difference and that truth, I think that's a key movement forward.
Yeah, thank you. Keith, how are you working with your clients in a virtual world? Is it enabling you to build trust, particularly with new clients, in the same way you would if you were, the opposite? Pete talked about board retreats. You're all in the same room, you're staying overnight, you're in a safe environment. It's very, very different feel, isn't it? Is it still working?
It's surprisingly effective. I think if you'd asked me 3 months ago, I would have said, well, it's going to be so difficult to build any sort of social cohesion or connection or reciprocity, that you do this for me, I'll do that for you, and we'll build. That stuff's been surprisingly straightforward. During lockdown, I've been coaching a team of 4 people based in Sweden that I've met once briefly, and we've developed this sort of special bond, if you like, that I could never have imagined at the start, and I've been coaching them to deliver training and to coach others, and it's been amazing. I've loved it. But it's not, so it enables some things, but it's not brilliant for other things. So I think one of the things Pete talked about was transparency and visibility. I think we can have the illusion of transparency. We're all in our postage stamp or our little box, and we're all seeing each other. I think we need to do more than that. It'd be easy to stop there. So transparency of results, transparency of feelings, transparency of thinking, transparency of behaviors. I think as leaders, we need to work more on that digitally, because it's not a given. The other thing that I learned about developing trust is that your eyes can deceive you. So we like to develop workshops where we get clients together and work to agree an approach and a way forward and thrash things out. You can do those things virtually, and you can genuinely believe that you're looking people in the eye and they're reciprocating, but they're really not.
You also don't know whose eyes you're looking into either.
No. You don't know where your screen is. There's a delay. You think the normal cues and facial tells and stuff, you think that's all normal, but it's absolutely not. And so yeah, there are things that are different, but overall I would say it's positive, and those that exploit the positives and are mindful of the drawbacks, I think, will prosper. So
if I broaden this out a bit, John, both in terms of the virtual world, but the post-COVID, although, like I say, I hesitate to use the word post-COVID. I don't think there is any such thing. I think it's an ongoing COVID. But how does this work building trust again across five 5 generations. You know, we have such a diverse workforce now, don't we? And if you look wider into society, such massive polarization starting to develop. How can a leader create trust across such a wide, diverse range of people with different needs, different experience?
Yeah, I think part of the humbling part of this is to realize that we're all sort of white belts when it comes to this. You know, we've lived in a world of power and authority. Most of us have been tutored and mentored and conditioned in a world where power and authority, you know, did all that for us. But as that gets sort of superseded, and as it falls away, I think we're all going to have to become more adept at building trust from first principles. You know, that sense of entitlement that trust comes with the job title, it will go, and we're all going to have to earn this on a daily basis. And I think that means we will all need to be much more intentional, particularly in a virtual environment. You know, we can't rely upon the social nuances. Even the handshake, which is the oldest symbol of trust that we know, has gone. Now, that doesn't mean to say we can't still build trust virtually. It just means to say we have to replace the handshake with something new. And therefore we have to be intentional about that. We have to design it. We can't rely on it just appearing through our collective social norms. Now, I, as a sort of someone who's passionate about leadership and trust, I think that's a tremendously exciting agenda and opportunity that forward-thinking leaders and brands will get to work on that. And what they'll do, they'll get to work on it at a psychological level, but they'll also marry it with technology that's going to move at an amazing pace. I mean, you think how much investment's going to go into these platforms now, compared, you know, so the combination of the technology getting better and better, and us getting psychologically more skillful and adept at intentional trust recreation, I think that promises a very rich virtual world over time. But I suppose we're all going to have to be a bit brave to wear the white belts, you know, and to accept that we're not immediately just going to wake up tomorrow and be wizards at that. You know, we're all going to have to learn a lot, and it's those that are willing to put themselves into that learning mode, I think we'll reap the rewards of that in 2-3 years time.
Yeah, thanks, John. If I may, I'm going to turn this on its head slightly, and it's something that Pete alluded to earlier. I think, well, in fact, you alluded to 2 things earlier, Pete. One, you said maybe we need to come back to talk about politics, the public world, public leadership. Inevitably, I don't think we could have this conversation without, I can't imagine why, maybe somebody has done a couple of things that weren't entirely trustworthy. But there's that. But there's also, you raised the point, Pete, about do we give our trust too freely and too easily? What happens when there is a breakdown of trust, when there's a breach of trust, whether it's in the public world or the commercial, professional world, or even the personal world? What happens with a breakdown in trust, and then how do you get that back again? Pete, do you want to kick us off?
2 thoughts. Yes, I mean, on the political world, to keep this one short, I want to go back to the word humility, and with the Keith used and John on benevolence, and just think I think at the beginning of this crisis, I think most of us thought, whatever our view on politics, we've got to invest faith in the government to lead us through it. Everyone involved in the public service, everyone about this, we're one team, one struggle, come through at the other side. And that awful Dominic Cummings moment that changed the world for a lot of us. And I think it's worth mentioning it because of the trust discussion here for 2 key reasons. One, we learned the policy of our Prime Minister is never say you're sorry. And I think actually to have trust, you must be able to say sorry and have the humility genuinely to say you're sorry.
Yes.
But secondly, and this is, I think, not uncommon, but this is dramatic for all of us as we live through it. Essentially, we have our elected leader, elected Prime Minister, who forfeited the trust, I think, of millions of us in him because of a one-to-one relationship, where the trust in that relationship came first. His concern to back his man, his guy, who's backed him, was the obsessive priority, and that overrode all else. And to an extent, they'll be saying, we've got away with it, we're still running a show, Dominic Cummings is having a say now with the Whitehall reform, etc. Now, I think as far as individuals, we need to take a personal decision. how much our values drive our behavior, whatever position we're in. And I think in my view, any principled leader, when they screw up or one of their key people screws up, must be able to say, you got that wrong. You might not have to go, but eat humble pie and own it and tell us why and show some sense of remorse. So I think there must be that candor or trust goes.
And especially if you think, again, without getting into too much detail on this, because I suspect the four of us could spend the next hour and a half talking about this alone, but I actually felt it got worse then by some of the excuses that came out.
Yes, I agree.
Tried to explain the behaviour. So even if my trust had been knocked a bit, they knocked it much, much worse by the way they behaved afterwards. So I wholeheartedly agree with you about that apology and honesty point.
I think it's tribal, Sarah. Pete used it earlier. If you don't associate with that tribe, then you think it makes it worse. If you do associate with the tribe, then you think that's an entirely good justification for what happens.
Yeah,
I think
fair point.
I think that does vary based on perspectives, which is part of the point around polarity. Really, you know, we can look at the same things and think entirely diametric things, and I think one of the challenges, I think, for us as leaders, for organizations, for people generally, for young people, is the ability to critically think, the skill of critical thinking, because there's so much information, whether it's misinformation, whether it's fact, whether it's opinion, assumption, whether it's myth in the world. And digital media these days has the ability to target that information to people depending on their sympathies.
Yes.
That sort of stuff can polarize, and I think having the ability to put that into context, to say where is this information from, what is the motivation of the person or the people who have published it, and what effect is it having on me, and how does this sit with my values and beliefs, and therefore what am I now going to do with this? I think the ability to take that, analyze it, synthesize it, and do something else with it, I think is a really critical skill that is going to become more critical as information is packaged up in seductive ways to
so
create.
That's a really interesting point, Keith. By definition, do you think it means that we are increasingly going to need to share values and share common purpose in order to trust?
I think people are going to need to know what we stand for, and are going to continually look to test us to see whether we really do.
Whether we mean
it. This whole thing, our actions are our real priorities.
Yes.
You know, and I think that I was sort of struck by that quote. I think it might be Covey or something. You know, we judge others by their actions and ourselves by our intentions.
Yeah.
And it's just not enough.
Yeah.
I think the words and actions point at the moment, there's so much transparency and visibility of it. And because of, as you say, the speed of information and everything as well, it will become so clear so quickly when people's words and actions don't match anymore. John, what's your take on this?
Yeah, just listening to that, you know, and you know, Pete talked about the Commons incident, and then of course we've had the Black Lives Matter, you know, protest. And you know, when you see pictures on your TV of statues being pulled down by sort of crowds that are overcome by a sense of passion, you know, whether you agree with, you know, the circumstances of that or not, but nevertheless you can't deny the strength of feeling that is out there on some of these topics. And I think, you know, we've had quite a lot of wake-up calls now, you know, as a leadership elite, if we want to use that phrase. We've had quite a lot of wake-up calls. You know, we had the global financial crisis. We've had Donald Trump. You know, we've had Brexit. We've had statues now being pulled down in Bristol or whatever. At what point are we going to realize that, you know, there is something here that needs addressing, that is calling for cultural renewal, and that rather than believing that it's sort of an isolated tactical phenomenon, that we actually recognize that it's something deeper that is shifted. And I think for as long as we don't acknowledge that and respond to it, we're going to keep stirring up some anger and some sort of pent up backlash that will keep slapping us around the face. And it's quite a hard pill to swallow, because we're probably talking about a level of change the likes of which none of us has ever seen. Yeah. And that's a bit scary, isn't it? But the risk is, if leaders don't come forward who are willing to sort of take that on and literally lead through it rather than react to it, then I think, you know, we won't get out of this current cycle. And I think, you know, that would be a great shame.
Totally agree. Well, you've probably seen some of the stuff I've written on this subject, but I do think we've been handed a unique opportunity to make a genuine difference. I mean, a step change difference. But listening to you talk there, it strikes me that in order to build trust, you have to truly listen and deeply listen. And, you know, what you were talking about there is, over the years, we've, you know, papered over cracks. I remember, you know, huge, I wasn't around, but huge civil unrest after Martin Luther King was shot. And then there were all sorts of inquiries set up, and then gradually the noise dies down. And here we are 50 years later with the same kind of social unrest linked to the same fundamental problems. So the listening that needs to happen now is on a deeper level than I think any of us have ever heard and listened before. And I think we need to give ourselves time to listen deeply and understand to a different level than we've ever understood before we just leap into action with all the usual stuff, whether it's another inquiry or, you know, another policy that never manifests. So I do think we've been handed a completely unique opportunity, but for me, trust in leadership in the middle of that is going to be pivotal to listening, and then the words and actions matching as well. So just to round up, because like I say, we could have had a 3-day event here, and we do need to round up. If I ask you to summarize what quick advice you would give, whether you want to give this advice out there to business leaders, to community leaders, to social leaders, if we are going to make a change by building trust in leadership, what would it be? What would your quick advice be to anybody who's managed to listen to us go on for probably 45, 50 minutes, 3 hours? I've no idea anymore how long we've been talking for, but what day is it? You know? So Pete, what would your quick advice be?
I suppose the thing that really interests me is for chief executives, when they communicate with their people in their organization, always to use a language and style that implies they're talking to equals. They're talking to people that are absolutely on a par with them. There's no notion of hierarchy. I literally, an hour before we started this call, I was talking to someone who I'm doing some work with at the moment, who's got a student job in one of the biggest charities in the country. And she said that someone had just left the organization after 20 years and had a note from the HR department. And the first line was, "Dear brackets name, end bracket." And what happens in so many organizations is at different levels, people communicate. No one ever looks at the communication. It's just, apart from the person receiving it. I think any CEO, it's a great thing. Just go onto a department and just make a point of asking for what's been sent out to people when they've been recruited, people when they've left, people after feedback, what goes with the invoice, at the end of a contract, what feedback is requested from the customer. Just have a random look at the communication and then look at your own and see whether it's respectful, because we know respect precedes trust. You only trust people who make you feel at some level significant and hopefully special. Yeah. So I think that's the point. It's always the context for trust. It must be one of a sense of equal respect and real attentiveness. And so often we miss that in the rush and the chaos of running organizations.
Yeah. Love that, Pete. Thank you. Thanks. Keith, you?
Yeah, just building on that. I think this empathy, curiosity, and transparency, I think all of those things really interesting to me. So I think if we're looking at organizations, vision and mission, what are we trying to achieve, and what's our place in the world? How are we making the world a better place? And to quote Gandhi, I think be the change you wish to see in the world. I think, you know, what are we for? What difference are we trying to make, and do it respectfully? And if we're individuals in an organization, what are our values? What's our purpose? And how are we living up to that? And I think if we're going to develop trust, then it comes with transparency. What am I for? What am I trying to do? And am I acting in ways that are consistent with that?
And that question you just asked about how are we living up to that, I think that's so crucial, isn't it? We have to keep asking ourselves that question and not make the assumptions, as Pete's intimated, that things are just happening the way we're expecting them happening because somebody pronounced it. We have to make sure we're living up to it. So, John?
Yeah, I think the two words, I mean, you talked about listening, Sarah, and Keith used a word there about curious. I think it's a time to be passionately curious about what's going on, and therefore that gives you the motivation to listen. Pete talked about trauma, and that we've all come through this in a different place. So if you carry on making decisions based on your view of the world as it was 5 months ago, you're probably going to miss something important. And the only way you're going to build a new map of the territory is through being really curious and really listening. And that deep listening you mentioned, Sarah, I think if we listen deeply at the moment, we'll probably hear something quite new, and that's very valuable information, isn't it, for leaders if they're making significant strategic decisions. Yeah.
Well, fascinating times. I feel like I'm living through a giant case study. I'm sure, I think you said it earlier, Keith, it'll only be when we look back, having put some time and perspective into this and look back at what's going on at the moment, that we'll know whether we've hit those moments of truth and actually built or eroded trust, and hopefully it will be the former. So I've loved talking to you guys. I want to keep going, but somebody's going to boot us off here in a second. Quite rightly as well. So anyway, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you, and I personally get so much value from my conversations with you that help me do some of this stuff better. So thank you so much for everything I've learned from all of you, and I will hopefully continue to learn from all of you. So, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. So really appreciate it.